But in all kinds of weather, we really don't all stick together. When I'm at UF, I don't feel like I'm a Florida Gator, but when I leave UF, I feel like I'm a Gator. I think it's because not everybody here knows that the university has problematic roots, and that there's no actual acknowledgement of injustices on our campus, especially when it comes to the history of race.
When I would hear that song at the ball games, I pretty much ignored it. I wasn't a part of the old boys they were talking about.
Now here's what a lot of people don't know. They don't know that anybody went to University of Florida in the 30s. But I was one of them.
Sometimes the dominant narrative tells a story that begins with integration, as if that marked Black presence for the first time at the University of Florida. A history happened before that. If we are not knowledgeable, others can manufacture our knowledge for us.
I integrated the Taggart Hall office. There was no Blacks working in offices. They were in custodial, if you know what I mean, and food service. Around this same time, Betty Stewart had been doing research on the testing that they require and the GPA that they required for admissions to the university, and the fact that African Americans could actually succeed with a C average, if that's all they had, in this school based on the kind of lifestyles they had had. And indeed, she was able to prove that, and that opened up the door to African Americans in this institution to test it.
UF desegregated in 1958, but there's a big difference between desegregation and integration. Now, I do think UF is a very diverse campus, but it's a matter of the whole idea of diversity versus inclusion. Do I think it's very inclusive? While there's a lot of progress, the University of Florida wasn't originally a space created for students of color.
The University of Florida, like many other predominantly white or historically white institutions in higher education, has a long history of excluding people of color from that institution. And when it essentially desegregated itself, all it did was desegregate itself. It did not integrate itself. So many of the Black students at UF felt marginalized, alienated, undersupported, disrespected.
Well, when I came up in '69, that year, it was the largest class of Black students. The only year that I lived on campus was my first year. They had one Black student per floor. And naturally, I made friends with the janitorial staff.
I felt very welcomed by the students. In the classroom, on the other hand, the teachers, for the most part, were not that welcoming, appeared resentful that I was there, gave me a hard time. There were a few who recognized my ability and were not as offended by this so-called integration. But there were many who were.
All of my professors were white. Most were racist, treating me like I didn't belong, expecting us not to do well.
When I came for an interview in 1970, there were no Black professors on the staff of the University of Florida. And they were on the court order to integrate the faculty and essentially to make a significant progress in terms of recruiting Black minorities and whatever, stuff like that. And so, and they were monitoring them. So I knew very well that that was the situation.
I was told that the only reason I was at this school was because the university was trying to reach the quota.
As Black students were finally being admitted to white universities, they were demanding that there be more Black faculty and a curriculum that was more multicultural.
All history was basically white history, the history of Western civilization. and that if you were not a card-carrying member of Western civilization, then basically the culture that you represented had not done anything.
The Black Student Union was very much involved in protesting and doing the things that were necessary to make it possible for the program to be here. So the program was put in place in 1969, and it hired its first director in 1970, and that was Dr. Ronald Foreman. He was the director of the program for 30 years, but for the many years that he was dedicated to serving the program, he didn't get the resources that he needed, because I don't think anyone really, to some extent, people didn't want this program here. They didn't respect it, and they didn't really respect him.
To let everybody know that, the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of student activism, and we all know that, but people tend to forget the activism of the 80s and 90s. Let's see, where do we begin? We created an organization called the Loyal Order of the 99. We were going to try to work in the community, on the campus, and throughout the state and throughout the country on this wide variety of issues that would, in a sense, change the template or the trajectory for 1999. There were housing incidents where students would be the victims of practical jokes. I remember one young woman had a bag of urine blown up in a balloon. She had that dropped on her head. We had the formation of white student unions sponsored by Klans, and we eventually got a white student union on campus that went around and promoted the notion that if you were a student of color, that you didn't deserve to be there because you were all affirmative action and unqualified, and you were taking jobs from qualified white men. We had a neo-Nazi movement moved across the streets on the university adjacent to 7-Eleven or something at the time, and they would randomly attack students of color, and we went to the local police, and they, their notion was, well, we can't do anything until we actually catch somebody, and so we started forming community defense units to do that. One particular year, I remember a particular meeting with President Bryan. He was an interim president at the time, and we talked about the fact that we were facing this kind of unjust and we felt discriminatory structure when it came to funding and it came to supporting student activities. And President Bryan, I'll never forget, he says, "Well, I've never experienced discrimination in my lifetime, and I've been in Florida my whole life." And all of us, a room full of people of color, we just kind of stared. It was almost surreal, because what in many ways it confirms that here you have the president of the university who's completely oblivious to issues that involve diverse communities, and so that means structures at the university that were supposed to be responsive were often not.
There just was a report that came out that UF's diversity index is like the bottom 10th of all public institutions. And when that report came out, I found it funny because the president sent out a thing praising that UF is in the top 10. It's a top 10. It's in the 8th. It's a top 10 university now, and this and that. But you give no recognition or no acknowledgement of this school being in the bottom 10th of diversity in Florida.
We have been pushing for the African American Studies major for years, and was getting the runaround. I don't know if a lot of people realize that. It was a program, it still is a program. When I came, they had a certificate in African American Studies only. That was in 2004. Then we got the minor, and then the major came out of protest. We did so many drafts of a proposal, and what would happen is that work on it, they submit it, it has to go to the college curriculum, it's past them, it's past the dean's office, then go to that, then the provost has to look at it, then it has to go back, and we kept getting for years. And then the blackface incident happened, and then they're gonna push it through. Mm-hmm. But typically what we have happen at UF is something terrible happens, and so then a deal is cut, and then they pretend to be committed to diversity, and then something gets passed.
You would have situations where students, Black students in a variety of majors at University of Florida could spend 4 or 5 or 6 years, however many years it is, and never have a Black faculty member. So they weren't really receiving a narrative around Black intellectualism. And in fact, they were receiving a message that intellectualism or intelligence resides in particular types of bodies.
And it's hard when you're the only one. So it's like you don't have anyone, you're just quiet. A lot of times you'll just sit there. I remember like having a psychology class my first semester. It was like developmental psychology. And we started talking about like how kids are raised differently and like based on race. So, you know, we're going to do like Hispanic, white, Asian, Black. And then, I don't know, I just felt like it was very Eurocentric. Like, you know, Black children are more loud and like, you know, they're a little bit more, I don't want to say like, he didn't say dangerous, but I mean, that's the way you're making it seem, like the way we're raised. We're very loud and physical. We'll have more anger. And it was just so like, oh my gosh, like this is what you're saying. I, of course, wouldn't say anything because I'm like, I am not saying nothing. But, you know, as soon as I left the class, I went and talked to my friends about it. So it's just like, I don't know, you're kind of just there taking in this Eurocentric lesson plan or like views of other students. And you're just like, what is going on here?
Let's go back to the storming of the president's office.
But it was the students who were pushing everything. People from Shaw University, you know, who had come out of that meeting deciding to create SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and to push the sit-ins, the wait-ins, the ride-ins. And, you know, and we decided that at UF, we had enough of a student population that we deserved to have a student organization, a Black Student Union.
The Black Student Union was already in existence, but it was very low key. So me and several other people, we got together and we redid the constitution of the BSU. We more or less modeled it after the Black Panthers. Instead of, you know, we had a chairman, had Minister of Defense, Minister of Information, that type of thing.
A seismic event the Black Student Union is known for is Black Thursday. Black students weren't happy with the experiences they had at UF, and Black Thursday is when these students came together to advocate for better Black experiences.
And so we got together. A few of us, myself, Dr. Formoter, we got together with the students. And we said, look, we have done our best. They will not, you know. So they decided that they were going to march. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that they were going to go to the president's office. Mm-hmm. We alerted the Minority Affairs Committee and the president that the students were going to come because they wanted to hear from him. No response. And the students did, in fact, go to Taggart with our support.
On April 15th, 1971, at 12:45 p.m., about 50 of us marched straight to President O'Connell's office with a list of demands.
1. Admit at least 500 Black students out of the 2,800 freshman quota each year.
2. Establish a Black Cultural Center.
3. Hire a Black administrator in academic affairs and recruit Black faculty.
4. Hire a Black assistant manager in personnel.
5. Hire Black faculty to reflect the ratio of Black students.
6. Have fair and equal treatment of Black brothers and sisters employed at UF.
We had a protest. We gave a set of demands to the administration. Then we had a sit-in in Stephen C. O'Connell's office. 60 or 70 of us got arrested. But in the end, that's how the Institute of Black Culture came into existence.
The Institute of Black Culture is a Black African cultural student center that has a long history at the University of Florida. Many of the Black students at UF felt marginalized, alienated, undersupported, disrespected, and they could find comfort, support, affirmation, validation in the Institute of Black Culture. It certainly wasn't the only resource on that campus, but it was a very important place for that community. A lot of the alumni had a very sort of strong connection to that space. It's the kind of thing that helps to retain students and make them feel like they belong at an institution that often is sending them messages both subtly and blatantly that they're not welcome.
For me, it was like these places really matter. And I didn't even think about it until I was doing my research. And it's like, I always say, like, I felt like I grew up. You know, I became more comfortable with being Black as I stayed in the IBC. And this kind of gave me a reason, like, why. Beyond, like, feelings and emotion, but, like, the whole negression theory of, like, how as Black people we develop our racial identity, which is something, you know, I'm thankful, like, being an African-American studies major, this is stuff we talked about. Like, it was very more, like, not so Eurocentric, but more of this worldview. Like, how do we develop as people rather than, like, this very American and white view. So that's something that I wanted to look at because I wanted to kind of connect it beyond like, oh, it's a safe space, but more so like it's needed for our development as college students. You know, like kind of we learned, it went through each stages. And, you know, like when you learn you're Black, how you become comfortable and then you kind of start to become an advocate. And it kind of acknowledges those feelings too. Like at some point you also start to become, not depressed, but like you start to realize the reality of it. And that can sometimes bring on like this feeling of sadness of like, how can you as a person change that? So it kind of gave me a reason like, oh, this is why I felt the way I felt.
UF was actually one of the first schools to open a Black Cultural Center in 1972, which I thought was really like not what I expected at all.
I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like, and I didn't even realize that those two other schools and then UF were kind of like, I think the first few, I'd say like within the first 5. So I think a lot of people they don't get that. I'm like, this is like our cultural center is one of the first. Like, because the 1970s is like this wave of Black students entering PWIs. And then so now they want safe spaces. So you see this wave of like, oh, cultural centers popping up. And the fact that we're one of the first is like, oh my goodness, like this is so cool. Like this is, I don't know, like kind of like a historic landmark, you know? But to them, like I said, I don't think they really care. Like they're not concerned about that.
We had a Malcolm X university every year, and Afrocentric University. And so we would teach classes focused on African culture, African history, so focused on the Institute for Black Culture. We had a very close relationship with the Institute for Black Culture at the time. And, you know, that was kind of an operational base. We really, really saw that as our home, you know, and the home of the community and a safe place. We argue that it wasn't just a place to, you know, throw up some artwork and listen to some concerts or something like that. We made it an educational and political kind of headquarters. And, you know, there were those at the university that weren't very happy with that. Some people decided one night to go and basically spray paint the N-word and a bunch of other things, you know, go home and so forth. And they put it all over the Institute for Black Culture. For the Morning Sun, we ended up at the university that gotten this painting crew out and they basically painted over it. And we responded by saying, okay, you can paint over it, but you can't deny it was there. And also, what are you going to do in terms of securing our facility? We wanted to teach the lesson that we as a community have to defend our facilities and stuff. We can't allow them to be attacked. We can't allow our people to be attacked. We can't allow our facilities to be attacked. And so, we put a 24-hour security detail around the IBC. And as a result of that, the university eventually added additional lighting in their own security because they didn't really want us out there. But we told them we would stay out there until you guys do something. And that's how we transformed the university. A lot of times they didn't want us to do it. They were like, oh, no, not those guys. So they would end up doing something they should have done in the first place because We're like, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. One of the big issues on campus right away was that, and maybe the issue that kind of catapulted us into a lot of involvement at the university, was the relationship between the student government at the time and student organizations. At the University of Florida, it was somewhat unique in that the student government was given a lot more autonomy. There was very much a hands-off approach. The student government was extremely unrepresented. It did not demographically, in terms of gender, race, class, any social variable you want to talk about, it was entirely unrepresented. You're getting this diverse student constituency, but you have a student government that only represents a few people. Like, one of the rituals that used to really offend me was each year, organizations from people of color, whether it was the Black Student Union, whatever it was, would go into a room with the budgeting bodies of the student government and try to convince them, that having money for Black History Month or having money for things that were relevant to their communities, whether that was worth, at least in their mind, student expense. And inevitably, that discussion is problematic. I mean, when you're going in front of another group, trying to convince them of the importance of your own humanity, your own heritage, that's a problem. It led to a great deal of hostility between, diverse student communities and student government. It led to protests, and we were intimately involved in that. And finally, matters reached a head in one particular year. We developed a new leadership, and we said, we are going to protest as student government.
MCDA and I guess UF as a whole tried to get try to take students' temperature with regards to replacing the physical buildings that the institutes were held in. And that opened up a can of worms and started a storm. Where was it, baby? Where were the institutes going to move to?
The Rights?
Yeah, they were going to move the institutes to the Rights. Students were upset because they thought that they would basically just have, a couple rooms in the Rights, and these places that were not just felt like home because of people who spoke like them, who sound like them, who support them, but also physical homes with couches and TVs, a place to interact very much like, you would with your friends at home. They felt like that was being torn from them, and students were very upset. And I think there was talk of shutting stuff down and not allowing it. And for a long time, administrators wanted to move forward on the idea, but it was a non-starter with students, and they just didn't want to get into it with students.
And alumni.
Alumni were not having it either. And of course, I think alumni probably had as much to do with it as current students at the time, because you don't want to alienate donors.
Everyone's favorite place has always been the house. So for most of the older ambassadors, we love the house. It's where we studied. That's where we had events. It's where we took naps. It's where we had some of our deepest conversations. It's where we made connections with some of the people that mean a lot to us now, or mean the most to us on this campus now. It's definitely where I made a lot of my first and closest friends. So the transition is a little bit more difficult because the house was a little bit more fun, a little bit more relaxed, and we had less of an eye on us. So definitely being a group of minority students, we're in this space where there's glass everywhere, and we're right in the middle of campus and right in the middle of a student hub. So it's a little bit of a challenge because sometimes we feel kind of like a spectacle because people are peering in on us. Oh, we've never been in here before. Whereas at the house, it was kind of we were free to be ourselves and have certain conversations and not worry about anything else.
There was a push to try to get student government to take over the funding of the institute, of MCDA, actually. I think our budget probably came from the Dean of Students office or somewhere, and they thought that more resources would be available if we were funded through student government. And so there was a push to try to facilitate that. And I was in a staff meeting one day when one of our superiors, like superiors, came to the meeting and said, basically told us that our strategy would be to try to convince students to lobby on our behalf for funding from SGA by implying that if SGA did not fund the institutes, they would be shut down, and MCDA would be shut down.
So when we got word that they were going to tear it down, it was like, okay, but why? So they were saying, well, you know, it has a lot of problems. It has, you know, rats and this and that. And I was like, okay, but you, administration, let it get to that point. You know, you neglected it over the years. You were supposed to redo it 10 years after it was built or it was given to you. You know, it was old, you know, it was supposed to already receive renovations years and years and years ago. And they never did it. So then we got word that they were trying to, they also shut down the La Casita. Mm-hmm. So we got word that they were trying to combine it. Mm-hmm. And it was like, what?
It is July 12th. I am here with
Daniel Clayton.
Could you tell me what brings you here today?
What brings me here today is I am a part of a coalition of students, and we just go under hashtag, moniker, whatever you want to call it, No La IBC Talk. So what that is, it's a combination of La Casita, which is the name for the Hispanic Latinx space on campus, and the IBC, the Institute of Black Culture, which is where Black students congregate, and also no, because we don't want a combination of these things to ever happen. We are communities, and we are able to appreciate how we interact with each other as fellow students of color because we have our own spaces that we can refer to whenever we feel oppressed, whenever we feel marginalized, but not even just when it comes to negative things, but we want to celebrate others and we want to celebrate ourselves. Those are the spaces that we're there for, and these spaces are not being respected. They're not being honored. They're not honoring the promises that they made to the Black Thursday protesters back in 1971. They're not honoring the promises that were made to the Hispanic Latinx students back in 1994. And they are disrespecting the legacy of every single Black student and every single Hispanic Latinx student that has come through the University of Florida and that has ever walked through those doors, or even if they've never walked through those doors. Those spaces are there for us. They are for us, by us. And it is because of this that the University of Florida is able to put on all of their information. Look, we're not racist. We actually have people of color here. Yes, but the numbers are dwindling. With each incoming freshman class, there are less numbers of students of color. Pretty soon, we're not even sure what that's going to look like. And without spaces like these for us to be able to talk about events that occur on campus, such as earlier this year, there was a noose hanging in a classroom, and we didn't necessarily have that space to be able to talk about it. We don't feel we don't feel safe talking about this in regular university buildings. We don't know who's listening. We don't know what the repercussions are going to be.
The day before the sit-in, BSU met and we organized who was going to actually be in the president's office. I wasn't in office because at that time I was the Minister of Defense. I was more or less a marshal on the outside to make sure that everybody was where they were supposed to be. And then when UPD came, nobody resisted or anything, and they had brought this bus, to take us down to jail.
Some 67 of us were arrested or suspended for staging our sit-in. Our amnesty requests were denied, so we held a rally where several of us submitted withdrawal slips in protest.
O'Connell was adamant that he wasn't going to create a Black Studies department. He wasn't going to set up an African-American house or cultural facility. And any student that kept pushing that, he'd simply kicked from campus. It became clear that the university wasn't interested in entertaining a Black cultural anything.
Over the next few days, Black enrollment dropped significantly because more than 100 Black students withdrew from the University of Florida.
Maybe it was from the dwindling of black enrollment or from all the protests, but as a coming together moment, O'Connell agreed to have an Institute of Black Culture, and that's how the IBC came to be.
The next academic year, he did everything we'd asked him to do, everything we had basically demanded, everything we had written down, including the creation of some of these spaces, and then claim credit for all of it.
So these institutions are so important, and in the early days, they often emerged as a result of student protests for these spaces to exist. That's true at San Francisco State, and it's true at the University of Florida. It's not the insight of university administrators knowing that they need to create these spaces for students. It's that they're a response to a demand because students are not being treated with respect or value at institutions where they attend.
I want to give thanks for the sacrifice that the alumni made to bring this building into position. And they did it out of necessity. And what's interesting is that they did it. They contributed towards something that most of them did not get the opportunity of having the privilege of being a part of.
There was a full sit-in, and people sat in the student government meeting. They also sat in at the student government office and refused to move. And so this was, the BAM movement completely, immobilized the student government that evening. And then, a smaller group of students decided that they would barricade themselves in the student government office and refused to come out until the issue was addressed. And so this was the kind of the penultimate night. I remember getting a phone call from my home and coming over and seeing all the students who had, they all had signs and so forth that we don't want to be treated this way. And you had the students barricaded in the office who, basically would only talk to me, and said what their demands were. And it was very interesting. And then you had the student government officials refusing to do anything. Now, the university at first was going to come in with the SWAT team and I guess forcibly remove all these people. And I made the case that you don't want to do that. University of Florida is going to be on TV. This is it. The reaction from the community and places around is not going to be good for the image of the university. You do not want to bring a SWAT team against unarmed students expressing their political will. We need to engage in some serious negotiations here. We ended up with an agreement in which, student government realized that it probably would be a good idea to fund Black History Month, and that was the end of it. One of the most fascinating things was at the end of the demonstration, the university was going to, I assume they were going to move in and arrest the students who had barricaded themselves in the office. But interestingly enough, the power was cut to the building just at the moment the demonstration ended, and all of the students who were in the office were gone when the lights came back on. I thought that was very interesting development. About 2 weeks later, one of the amusing things was the university asked me for my ID, and I gave them my ID. They were trying to prosecute me and some other people for allegedly coordinating all of this, but what it really was, students had had enough. Many of the organizations that are created on campuses for students of color and so forth and so on are kind of created in this beggar position where they see their role as kind of begging the administrative structure for money and resources on behalf of their constituency. And that leads to a leadership that is inclined to beg. They're not inclined to direct action, to protest, to sit-ins, to, these are people who basically are like, well, I guess we got to ask them. Well, they said no. Let's ask them again. Let's ask them again. I am totally hostile to that kind of leadership.
The other thing I want to give thanks to is for those directors such as V and all those directors that have come since the inception of the IBC. Because in all their own way, they invested nights, days, years of blood, sweat, tears because it was something that they believed in, and it was students that they believed in, and it was a cause that they believed in.
The fate of the houses belonging to the Institute of Black Culture and Institute of Hispanic Affairs is still up in the air, but today, members of the two communities made sure university officials know exactly where they stand. More than 100 members of the Hispanic and Black community at the University of Florida chanted, "The community united will not be beaten." They marched through the campus speaking out against the new design, a proposal that would join the IBC and La Casita buildings. The group stormed into an ongoing Multicultural and Diversity Affairs board meeting, demanding the two cultural buildings remain separate.
We are here because we have tried every other way that we possibly know how to get the attention of the administration and MCDA to hear our voices, and we felt like we have not been heard. And so today is a protest for our voices to be amplified and for our voices to be heard by the people who need to hear them.
Although the meeting was adjourned minutes after, the floor was open for discussion and opinion. Daniela Garrido, WUFT News.
We need more people like that, and I wish that their peers and the university had appreciated them in a different way, because what they are asking for is space. Space for people that look like them that's needed in a place that's not for them in the same way that they need it, you know? So that was a wonderful, beautiful thing to watch.
The IBC is just as much a part of U of history as anything else that's going on this campus. But the IBC must continue to grow to be greater than the space that is going to be allocated on this campus. It has to reflect the place that it has in all of our hearts, in all of our souls, in all of our minds. It has to grow larger than the space, because while we will have a new building in a couple of years, guess what? In another 40-some years, that building is going to be old too. We have to always give thanks. We have to always reflect on where we come from, but we have to always keep it in perspective of what we're doing and where we are going. And most importantly, I want to say thanks to all of you. Because without the legacy being pushed forward and being carried forward, then there is no IBC, there is no story.